Hi there and welcome to the latest demo on the channel. So today I've got a bit of a Rube Goldberg machine for you. It doesn't really do anything that useful in real life because if you've already got a CSV, then just ingest it into your data platform. There's no need for that to become events. So the purpose of today is really to go through how Azure functions work, how we're going to create an Azure function, the code that you need in there to make it work. A few of the little nuances in there that you might need to be aware of, but also ultimately this is something that can be used for testing event hubs. So previously we've had the Garmin watch demo where I was sending real-time heart rate data from my watch to a event hub, and today's demo is going to be a very similar thing where we're just going to create a spreadsheet with some test data in. The Azure function is going to pick up that spreadsheet from blob storage whenever it's dropped in there, and it's going to use the columns. No matter what columns you put in there, it will use those as parameters in a JSON file, and it will send one row at a time to the Azure Event Hub. You can run multiple of these at the same time against the same event hub, so you can really scale up the number of events that you're getting, but it also just allows you to test event hubs. We can also set a delay timer within the functions so that you don't just send 10,000 events in a couple of seconds. By default, the code that I've put up in the repository is going to wait 1 second in between sending each event. So it's not randomly incoming events, it's going to be a fairly steady stream, but you would be able to use that for testing stream analytics, testing through to Cosmos DB, or even testing into Power BI, just so that you can visualize that data on real-time dashboards. So with that, we'll get started with the demo. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video, and thanks for watching. So first things first, go into the portal and we're going to create a couple of resources. The first one is going to be our function app. This will be a standalone function app using just a consumption plan, so we don't need to create clusters or anything like that. It's just pure PaaS. Optionally, if you're going to use this a lot, then you might want to change the way that you're paying for it. So for the demo, we're going to create a function app demo resource group to keep everything nice and tidy so we can delete it later as usual. And then give your function app a name. This is purely just the name that it's going to sit at in the service. We're not going to really be using that name for anything. Leave the hosting default for the demo. This is just going to be a standard hosted one. And we're going to choose .NET Core because the code that I've created is in C#. Obviously you will be able to use Python or Java or whatever if you're writing these yourself. Next, we're going to create a storage account. This is going to be where we put the CSV files, so the function app is going to be watching this storage account, looking for new files. When it sees one, it will pick it up and process it. So give the storage account a name, and as ever, always make sure that you're setting it back to local redundant storage just to save some money. And then finally, we're going to create a event hub. This will be what the function app submits events to. So when it receives a CSV, it's going to take each individual row of that CSV and submit it as an individual JSON document as an event into the event hub. This is purely for testing purposes. It's not really a very useful thing. As I said in the intro, in real life you would just ingest your CSV as a file. This is wildly inefficient. It's a Rube Goldberg type thing. It's a useless machine that does the same as something much simpler. But for testing event hubs, you need a source of events, and this is a pretty good one. So when you create the CSV file, you'll be able to have arbitrary columns, and it will just take those column names and column headers and turn that into a JSON document. So in the storage account, once that's created, we'll create a container called CSV blobs. That will be the location we dump the blobs into. And then we're just going to copy this access key, which we'll later use to configure the function app. Next, we're going to go into the event hub and create an actual event hub. just give it a name and click on create. So this is what we would use to read those events once they've been submitted. And then, as before, we're going to go into shared access policies, and we're going to just create one specifically for this application. So call it function app. In production, you would probably be more specific than just function app. We're giving permission to send events. Once that's created, click on the function app policy and just copy that connection string. We're going to paste it again into Notepad so that we can then copy that later and paste it into the function app. So finally, we're going to go into that function app and click on configuration. There's no actual function app here yet. We're just configuring the environment. And here, new application setting. And these are basically just variables to configure the function app. For convenience, I've put the names in here, but they were in the instructions. So CSV blob store, and we're going to paste the blob store connection string. And then we're going to create a second one called Event Hub Connection and paste in the connection string for the Event Hub. And don't forget, these are specific connection strings for those services. They've got the credentials already in them, so be very, very careful with them. And also the ones that I'm using here, I've not blanked them out or anything because the services will be destroyed hours, if not weeks or months before you run this, so that they won't actually work. So in Visual Studio now, we're going to create a new project, and that project type is obviously Azure Functions, C#, and we're just going to give that a name and click create. And this is just going to create us a project with all the right settings and stuff. So next we're going to set up the blob trigger. You can do this empty and just do it when you write the code. It makes very little difference. The path on the blobs is going to be CSV blobs, and we don't need the storage emulator for this scenario. So for this purpose, we're just going to use the cloud storage. So once that's done, you'll end up with a project, and first thing we need to do is add in a extension. This is for the Event Hub binding. So right click on your project in the Solution Explorer and go to Manage NuGet Packages. And in here, we're just going to go to Browse, and we're going to search for the Event Hubs one. So here I've just referred back to the instructions for the Azure.WebJobs extensions Event Hubs. It's hard to remember. Normally you'd be looking these up in the documentation, which we'll look at in a moment. But for now, I've just copied and pasted for simplicity. So click OK to that, and then agree to the license terms, and that extension will be installed. And so next we're going to configure some local settings. The local settings are exactly the same as the application settings that we've just configured in the service on the portal. So in here, again, I'm going to copy these same things that we pasted in before, and I'm just going to paste them in after the values that are here. So these are just key value pairs, and they do exactly the same thing as the other ones. The one that I didn't set here is Azure Web Job Storage. Later on, you'll see me paste that in just before we do the test at the end. And the connection string for that is for the blob store account that was created automatically when you created the function app. I didn't do it here, and I didn't re-record the video. It didn't seem worthwhile. You'll just get an error message if you don't set that, and you'll have to set it up. So to find the documentation, I'm going back into the instructions of the demo and just doing a search for triggers and bindings, and the link is there. Obviously you can search for this online as well, just for Azure function bindings. So this documentation shows you what you can do, where you can have a queue input and output, or you could have a timer. You could do various things, and that explains the scenario. So with a timer, you might have a blob as the input, and every time the timer goes off, you look at the blob. And then we've got documentation for the individual bindings themselves. So this is where you can find all of the information that I've used. It's not that straightforward documentation, but once you've watched this video, you should understand enough to be able to use that to find what you need. So if you come to the output section, we're using this as an output binding. So you've got two different ways that you can use this, either as a static function. So public static string run means that this runs once, then it does a return of a string because we said static string. The alternative is to run this as an asynchronous task using public static async task. And there, what we do is we can return multiple values, and we can just use that await command, send another value into the output, and that will keep looping around until it's finished with all the values. Finally, there's the host.json settings, which in this instance we're just copying and pasting. This is going to set the frequency that it checks the batches. It's going to set maximums for these things. You can change those values if you want to. The information's in the documentation, but the defaults are fine. So finally, we're going to start copying the code in. First up, I'm going to set this to a public static async task because we're reading in one CSV with potentially 10,000 values, 10,000 rows, and we want to return those one at a time. That's purely for demo purposes. You probably wouldn't do that in real life. To use this public static async task, we need to add the system.threading.tasks clause at the top there, just so that it's recognized. And this allows us just to do that asynchronous return. We can use SDKs directly to submit events rather than doing it this way, but this is asynchronous, so it's multi-threaded. It will be quicker if you've got multiple tasks going through. So really, this is a better way of doing it than to use an SDK, which I've seen in some other demos. So next, we're going to add the event hub. This is a C# attribute, if you're interested what the square bracket notation is there. And in here, we're just giving the event hub a name of dest. That's what was in the documentation. We never used that, so I left it there. Connection is event hub connection. That's what we set the attribute to, the application setting. And when you actually run this, a file gets created which will document what these application settings are. So that's where those are coming from. You can see that CSV blob store and event hub connection. So next, I'm pasting in the main body of the code. In this code, effectively, we're logging the fact that we've triggered the function, and then we're setting up a stream reader to connect to the blob that we found. And this will literally just connect to that blob and read it line by line. The first one, we're reading the header. If you don't have a header, it's going to use it as a header anyway. This is a really basic bit of code just to show you how these work. So first we read that into a variable called headers, which is a array. Next, we're going to read line by line. And for each line, we again read one line and split that out into values based on the comma. So we have to read a CSV here. Again, it's really basic code. So once we've done that, we do a for loop to do almost all of the values and add them into the JSON manually. I did consider using a proper JSON handler for this, but it just seemed too much effort. And then finally, we add the last value without the comma to make it valid JSON. So that's why that's outside the loop. And finally, we submit that output to the multi-threaded. You also saw there was the delay by 1000 milliseconds, just purely to slow this down. If you don't put that in, or if you set that value to 0, things will happen way too quickly. All of your events will just go to the event hub. It's very capable, so it can soak up these events really easily. So finally, we're going to click play. You can see here that I've just pasted in that storage account funct8838. That's the one that was automatically created, basically. Once that's up and running, I'm going to browse for a file and use the randomdata.csv that was in the GitHub. I've generated this. You could generate your own. It doesn't matter how many columns you use. It should work. It doesn't matter how many rows you've got. Just fill it with random data, and within a few seconds it will see that file and it will run. And then you can see the outputs that we did with that log information being dumped onto the screen. And all this is doing is submitting them one at a time to the Event Hub. And you can see that if you monitor the Event Hub too. So the last thing to do is actually publish this to the service. Just hitting play in Visual Studio runs it locally. So we're going to publish this to the service, and then it will be available, and it will just continue running as and when you need it. So here we're going to find the function app demo that we created. CSV to EH was the function we created within that resource group. And then click publish. And that will then do a build of the function. This is just asking you if you want to update. Once the build is done, it will package that into a deployment zip and send it off up into the service, which will then obviously unzip it and start running it. So it takes a few seconds just to run through those, and then it takes a few seconds to upload it. But you can see the green progress bar there. And once that's done, everything's finished, and we can now look at the service on the internet. So if we go back to that resource group and just hit the function, and you can now, once it's loaded, it takes a few seconds, you see the whirling progress there. Then you'll see function 1 has appeared, which was the name of the function. And this is the auto-generated file. We can see the blob trigger CSV blob store there. The Event Hub one doesn't get copied into there, so you just have to look into your code for that. Also, we can hit live metrics, so we can actually see what's happening in real time. So if you now go back in, delete the CSV, re-upload it, you would see some action in here. I'm not going to show that here now. It does work, and it starts throwing events over. And obviously you can see those events over in Event Hub anyway. So that's the demo done for today. Hopefully you enjoyed that. Your first introduction to functions on the channel. These can be really useful, so we'll go into more detail in the future using things like Cosmos DB, change feeds and that kind of stuff. But for now, that should get you going. It should get you to understand how to use the various bindings to make your own functions and really get up to speed very quickly with the technology. So if you enjoyed that, please subscribe down below, hit the like, it helps us to show up in the algorithm on the channel. And if you subscribe, obviously, then it shows up in your own feed so that you never miss any of the demos as they come along. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you next time.